Video, we're going to be talking about some of the new ideas that come around in the North during the mid-1800s. Here are the goals for today's video. We're going to be talking about the rise of the labor movement, the beginning of the women's rights movement, and also a new set of ideas that became popular during this time period called Transcendentalism. Alright, so let's get started with the labor movement. So, as northern factories grew, more and more members of northern society became factory workers. What this meant is that there were a large portion of the population in the north who spent most of their time laboring in factories. And so the wages for adult male workers in factories were actually okay. They were better than you could make, like, say, working on somebody else's farm. But the conditions were really bad. For example, you would have to work 13 hours a day, and you would usually perform just one simple task over and over again. And after you finished working, you'd be so exhausted that basically the only thing you would want to do is go home and sleep, and then you'd wake up and do it all over again. On top of this, dangerous machines that people used would put people at risk. So like you could lose a finger or a hand or even die working in some of these factories. You could also be fired for any reason. So if you showed up a couple minutes late and you were dependent on this job to support your whole family, your boss could let you go, basically no questions asked. Also, child labor was really common at this point, and it prevented the children of workers from receiving an education. So this kind of meant that they were going to be stuck working in factory jobs like this for their whole life. And last of all, the people who owned the factories, the bosses, got super rich, but the workers made just enough to get by. And this started to seem really unfair to a lot of workers. And so in response to all of this, a lot of workers get together to try and make their lives better. What the workers want are a couple things. They want shorter working hours. They demand a 10-hour day, which is actually really long by today's standards. They ask for better pay. They ask for safer working conditions so they don't have to worry about getting hurt on the job. And they also demand public schools so that their children can go to school and get educated while the workers are off earning money in the factory. And in order to get these goals, the workers get together and organize in a couple different ways. First of all, they organize politically. Because of spreading democracy in America, by 1840, workers can all vote. And they usually give their votes to people who support the workers' cause. And at first, these votes go to something called a workmen's party. And this is a party or a group of parties that basically try to elect leaders who will pass laws to help workers. Eventually, though, the Democratic Party kind of soaks up a lot of the Workmen's Party's ideas, and the Democratic Party becomes a party that supports mild improvements in workers' conditions. The other way that workers could try to make their lives better were through unions. And a union is when workers would join together to bargain with factory owners. And so basically they'd all get together and they'd have some spokesmen go up and they'd try to make a deal with a factory owner for maybe safer conditions or better pay. And if the factory owner refused to cooperate with the workers, then the workers could call a strike. That is, all the workers in a certain industry would stop working, and that would mean that the boss would be losing money every day. So unless the bosses gave the workers some of what they wanted, then the workers didn't have to go back to work. And this was a good way to get the bosses to give in to some of the workers' demands. In these ways, life gets a little better for American workers during the 19th century, but a lot of the really major reforms that make life much more livable don't come around until the 20th century, that is the 1900s. So it's a long, slow process for labor to kind of win the rights that they feel they deserve. Also, factory owners are opposed to all of this. They don't like it because every time the workers get something more, that means that they are losing money, the factory owners are. Because if the workers work fewer hours, then they can't make as much stuff. If they have to pay the workers better, then that means that they don't get to keep as much of the profit from selling the stuff that gets made in the factory. So kind of what we see from the 19th and the 20th century is this long struggle between workers and bosses. And some would say it's still even going on today. Women's rights, and this is another kind of reform movement that comes about during the 1800s. So at the beginning of the 1800s, that is the 19th century, women had very few legal rights. They basically, when they were born, belonged to their fathers, and they were all expected to get married, and when they got married, then they legally belonged to their husbands. And the most important aspect of this was that whenever a woman got married, all of her property would go to her husband, and her husband would now own all of that stuff. And on top of this, women were expected to work at home, and they didn't receive any pay. And they were also expected to bear children, and many women die in childbirth. So it's actually quite a dangerous job to be a housewife back then. And on top of all this, women had no right to vote, so they couldn't really change any of this by going to the government. But all this begins to change during the 19th century, partially because the market revolution gives new economic opportunity to single women. On top of this, a movement for gender equality begins to emerge around 1850, and it continues to grow from then on, and ultimately leads to much greater rights for women. So the women's rights movement kind of goes along a couple different fronts. But basically, in all of these different ways, women start pushing back against gender inequality. One way that women do this is that they refuse to get married. And what this means is that instead of becoming the property of their husband, they keep all of their own property and can do whatever they want with their lives. And some sources say that up to 10% of women in the 1800s choose not to get married. On top of this, more women begin to attend colleges, and they start to achieve high status positions in society. One famous example of this is Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, who's the first woman to get a medical degree in the United States, and she gets this in 1849. On top of this, some leaders begin to emerge for the women's rights movement, and they start organizing women to act to increase their political rights. And the two big names in this movement are Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And both of these guys work for greater equality for women. On the same line, there's a big important meeting at a place called Seneca Falls. And here at this place, all the leaders of the women's rights movement get together and they draft a declaration similar to the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. But this declaration declares that all men and women are created equal. And on top of this, they demand the vote for women. And so all of this is the start of a movement that eventually earns the vote for women in 1918. But as you can see, it takes like 68 years just to get that. And getting the vote is really just the first step, because there are lots of other problems in society that have to do with inequality between men and women. Another really big idea that comes around during the middle of the 1800s is this movement called Transcendentalism. And so basically, as more and more people start moving to cities and taking on repetitive day jobs, some American thinkers begin to question this new way of life. And these guys are called the Transcendentalists. They're questioning this movement towards factories and cities. And they're called the Transcendentalists because they believe that each individual needed to kind of transcend or go beyond the everyday world and to find their own individual higher truth. And so some of the principles of Transcendentalism were independence, self-reliance, and natural beauty. So independence says that they basically believe that every individual should think for himself or herself, rather than take orders from bosses or the government. Connected to this was the idea of self-reliance, where Transcendentalists argued that it was better to rely on your own ideas and your own skills than to get sucked up into the big emerging city life where you're dependent on everybody else for all of the stuff that you need. And finally, there was this idea of the beauty of nature, where they celebrated the natural environment and rejected the cramped and dirty city life. And so in all of these ways, Transcendentalism was actually a reaction against the Industrial Revolution. So just as America starts really becoming urban and industrial, the Transcendentalists start to argue that this is not how we should live, and we should live simply as we have in the past. Transcendentalist movement, some of the most important American writers emerged. And three of the biggest names from this movement were Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Walt Whitman. Emerson was the leader of the whole Transcendentalist movement, and he kind of came up with a lot of ideas that other Transcendentalists later developed more fully. And so one thing that he did is he called for Americans to remain self-reliant in the face of increasing industrialization. He wanted us to question this new life of production and consumption and stuff like that. Henry David Thoreau kind of takes Emerson's ideas and puts them into action. Thoreau argued that men, rather than striving for wealth, should instead try to live simple and thoughtful lives. He thought that this was the real way to achieve happiness. He also put his ideas into practice by living for 2 years in a small cabin that he built by hand out in the woods by a pond called Walden Pond. And when he went there, he wrote this famous quote that you can see here, where he said, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." So basically, he wanted to get away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life in order to learn what life was really all about. And he also argued, Thoreau did, that it was better to break unjust laws than to follow them, even if this meant going to jail. And this idea was later picked up by important revolutionary leaders like Gandhi and also Martin Luther King Jr. And finally, there's Walt Whitman, who is considered to be one of the first great American poets, and he puts many transcendentalist ideas into verse. So all three of these guys make a big impact on American culture, and they all come out of the Transcendentalist movement. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you tomorrow.